The Benue River was wild that evening, its dark surface twisting under the last light of day like something alive and angry. People had gathered along the muddy bank, some returning from the market, some carrying bundles home, some simply pausing to watch the water rush past. Then, in one terrible moment, the crowd's attention snapped toward a sound that cut through everything. A splash, a cry, then frantic thrashing. A young man in a wheelchair had slipped from the wet edge and vanished into the current. His chair lay tilted in the mud, one wheel still spinning, while his body fought to stay above the surface. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Men shouted, women gasped, a boy yelled for help. Two people pulled out their phones. Several others took a step closer, then back again. Fear spread faster than action. The river was too strong, the current too dangerous, the risk too high. But on the far side of the crowd, a young girl carrying a shallow tray of roasted ground nuts and sachets of water heard the panic and ran. She did not ask who he was. She did not stop to calculate whether she was strong enough. She did not wait for someone braver to go first. Zainabu Musa dropped her tray into the dust, kicked off her worn sandals, and threw herself into the river. By the time her body struck the water, the young man had already gone under again. The cold current slammed into her like a wall, dragging at her clothes, pulling her sideways, but she forced herself up, gasped, and searched. For one terrifying second, she saw nothing except black water and silver light. Then a hand surfaced, weak and desperate, before slipping back down. Zainabu lunged toward it. Her arms burned instantly. The river was stronger than she had expected, and the young man was heavier than she was prepared for, his body dead weight in her grip as panic fought through him. She caught his wrist first, then hooked her arm around his shoulder and tried to keep his face above the surface. The current tugged at both of them, spinning them off balance. On the bank, the crowd shouted instructions that meant nothing in the water. "This way! Hold him! Don't let go!" Still, no one entered. Zainabu clenched her jaw, kicked harder, and dragged him inch by inch toward the shallower edge. Her lungs felt as though they would burst. Her vision blurred. Once, she almost lost him. Once, the river nearly took them both. But when her strength began to fail, two men finally rushed in from the bank, wading deep enough to catch the drowning man under his arms and pull him the rest of the way out. They dragged him onto the mud, and Zainabu collapsed beside him, coughing river water, her chest heaving, every limb shaking with exhaustion. The young man lay motionless for a moment, water pouring from his mouth, until one violent cough tore through him and air forced its way back into his lungs. Relief rippled through the crowd like a prayer answered too late. Then someone bent over him, stared hard at his face, and said the name that changed the atmosphere in an instant. "That is Malik Danjuma, Alhaji Idris Danjuma's son." The murmurs spread so quickly they became a wave. Malik Danjuma, the son of the man whose trucks crossed borders, whose name opened offices, whose influence stretched from Garua to Yaoundé and beyond. People stepped back, then forward again, suddenly aware that this was no longer an ordinary accident, and no longer an ordinary rescue. But Zainabu, still lying on her side in the mud, barely reacted. She did not know Malik Danjuma. She did not know his father. She only knew that someone had been disappearing beneath the water while everyone watched. A woman knelt beside her and whispered, almost in disbelief, "Do you understand who you just saved?" Zainabu coughed, pushed wet hair from her face, and answered in a cracked but steady voice, "I understand he was drowning. Before anyone could say more, the shriek of tires broke through the noise. 3 black vehicles swept toward the riverbank and stopped hard. Doors opened at once. Security men poured out, scanning the area, pushing the crowd back. The air changed. Order replaced chaos. Authority replaced confusion. And then, slower than the others, but more powerful than all of them, a tall man in a flowing white kaftan stepped from the last vehicle. Alhaji Idris Danjuma. Even in that muddy place, surrounded by noise and breathless gossip, he looked like a man used to having the world rearrange itself around him. He said nothing at first. His eyes moved once over the scene. The river, the crowd, the wheelchair in the mud, his son wrapped in a blanket by the bank, and finally the soaked girl who had saved him. When he reached Malik, something flickered across his face. Fear, perhaps, or guilt, but it vanished almost as soon as it appeared. He touched his son's shoulder, leaned close, heard that he was breathing, then turned toward Zainabu. She met his gaze without defiance and without submission. She was too tired for either. "You went into the river," he said. It was not praise, it was fact. "Yes," she answered. He looked at her for a long moment, as if waiting for the next thing, for a request, a plea, a performance, some sign that she understood what his gratitude should cost. "Why?" he asked. Around them, people listened. Zainabu blinked once, confused by the question. "Because he needed help," she said. Nothing in her voice changed. No trembling, no attempt to impress him. Just the truth. Idris Danjuma studied her, and for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in a very long life, built on money and leverage and transaction, he stood before someone whose answer did not bend toward power. Malik was carried away to the hospital under bright lights and urgent hands, but the last thing he saw before the car door shut was the girl on the riverbank still kneeling in the mud, gathering the few scattered groundnuts that had spilled from her broken tray, as if nothing in her life could afford to be wasted. He wanted to call out to her, to ask her name, to stop the moment from ending before he understood it, but the vehicle doors closed and the convoy pulled away. That night, as doctors checked his lungs and monitors traced the steady return of his breathing, Malik drifted in and out of sleep with river water still burning in his chest. Yet through the blur of hospital lights and medical voices, one thing remained sharp. A face framed by wet braids and exhaustion, and a voice that had said, with no drama at all, "You are safe." It was strange to him, not because someone had saved his life, but because she had done it without knowing who he was. Almost everyone in Malik's world knew exactly who he was before they spoke to him. Some lowered their voices. Some became careful. Some became false. Some became cruel in polite ways. But none of them had looked at him the way she had looked at him in those few stunned seconds by the river. Not as Idris Danjuma's son. Not as a burden in a wheelchair. Not as a mistake. Not as a symbol. Just as a human being standing at the edge of death. Malik had not always lived like a shadow. Before the illness took his legs at the age of 9, he had been noisy, curious, fast, impossible to contain. He had run barefoot through the courtyards of his father's compound, climbed mango trees, chased mechanics into the garage with questions, and annoyed the house staff with a restlessness that made everyone laugh. But when fever and delayed treatment left him unable to walk, everything changed, and not all at once. At first, his father fought it with the fury of a man convinced that money could reverse any insult. Specialists were flown in. Machines filled entire rooms. Therapists came and went. Promises were made in whispers outside doors. But when recovery never came, love in that house did not disappear. It hardened. And hardened love, Malik learned, can wound more deeply than hatred. Idris Danjuma stopped entering his son's room as often. Conversations shrank. Smiles became rare. Staff remained respectful, but distant. Tutors continued lessons. Meals arrived on time. Medicine was monitored. Security was tight. The house ran perfectly. Malik was not abused. He was managed. Protected, his father called it. Hidden, Malik came to understand. People are not kind, Idris would say when the subject of going out arose. Everything you need is here. But what Malik needed most, connection, laughter, unpredictability, dignity, did not live inside controlled walls. Outside those walls, on the other side of the city, Zainabu Musa's life had never offered the luxury of being hidden. She was 19 and already carried herself like someone much older. Not because she wanted to, but because hardship had pressed years into her bones. She lived in a narrow two-room house at the edge of a crowded neighborhood with her younger sister Safiya and her little brother Bashir. Their mother had died during a difficult rainy season, when the fever clinics were overcrowded and medicine came too late. Their father, once a laborer at the river docks, had been killed in a transport accident the following year. Since then, Zainabu had become everything at once: provider, protector, parent, shield. Before dawn each morning, she bought what little she could afford: groundnuts, roasted maize, sachet water, sometimes fried bean cakes if the oil prices had not risen too sharply. She sold them in the market or on the roadside until her throat dried and her feet ached, and the sun stripped the color from the sky. Still, she gave food to children who hovered too long beside her tray. Still, she shared what she barely had. Some people called her foolish for it. "Kindness will not feed your house," an older vendor once said. Zainabu had simply replied, "Maybe not, but without it, what kind of house am I feeding?" The day after the rescue, while stories rushed through Garoua faster than the morning traffic, Zainabu woke with sore arms and a bruised chest and prepared for work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. There was no room in her life for lingering over heroism. Hunger did not pause for applause. At the market, however, the atmosphere had shifted. People stared. Some pointed. A man she had seen 100 times buying cola nuts stopped and asked quietly, "You are the girl from the river?" Zainabu nodded once and continued arranging her basket. Others came with louder questions. "Is it true he is the son of that rich man? Did they reward you? Did they promise you anything?" She answered only when necessary, and always the same way. He was drowning. But attention attracts more than admiration. An older woman selling smoked fish nearby laughed harshly and said, "You had the chance of a lifetime and probably came back with empty hands. Poor people like us do not throw away moments like that." Zainabu looked up, calm as ever. "I did not save him for payment," she said. The woman snorted. "Then you are poorer in the head than in the pocket." Zainabu returned to work. She had heard worse. Around noon, a polished black SUV rolled to the edge of the market, and silence spread before it like a shadow. Two men stepped out and walked directly to her stall. "Are you Zainabu Musa?" one asked. "Yes." "You are requested at St. Mary's Private Hospital." "By who?" The man hesitated only a second. "Alhaji Idris Danjuma." Several nearby vendors stopped pretending not to listen. Zainabu looked down at her basket, at the half-sold groundnuts that still stood between her family and dinner, then back up. "I have work," she said. The man, trained for resistance of other kinds, seemed briefly unprepared for this one. "This is important," he replied. Zainabu's voice remained even. "So is food." The second man, older and perhaps wiser, softened his tone. "The young master asked for you." That changed something, not because Malik was powerful, but because she remembered the confusion in his eyes when he surfaced, the way he had looked at her as though her presence meant more than rescue. After a long breath, she covered her basket with cloth and agreed to go. The hospital felt like another country. The floors gleamed. The air smelled clean and expensive. People moved with the quiet efficiency of a place where suffering was organized, contained, and billed. Zainabu followed the men through bright corridors, every step reminding her that she did not belong in such spaces, at least not by the rules the world seemed to prefer. When she entered Malik's room, he was propped up in bed, pale but conscious, with a monitor tracing his heartbeat in soft green lines. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment the strangeness of everything fell away. "You came," he said. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. "They said you wanted to see me," Zainabu replied. Malik nodded. "I needed to thank you." She shook her head almost immediately. "You do not need to thank me." He frowned. "Why not?" "Because I did what anyone should do." Malik looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, "No, not anyone." There was no bitterness in his tone, only truth, and it settled heavily between them. Zainabu noticed how careful he was even while lying still, as though pain had taught him to measure every movement. He noticed the calluses on her hands, the exhaustion that clung to her, even in a quiet hospital room. "I do not know your life," he said after a pause. "And I do not know yours," she answered. "But in the river," Malik said, "none of that mattered." Zainabu did not reply, because part of her knew he was right, and another part feared what it might mean if he kept being right. The door opened then, and Idris Danjuma entered. His presence did what it always did. It changed the temperature of a room without raising its volume. Malik straightened slightly. Zainabu rose out of instinct, not obedience. Idris studied her in silence, then said, "Sit." It was not a request, yet not exactly a command either. She sat. He remained standing beside his son's bed for a moment, then faced her fully. "You risked your life for my son," he said. "Yes." "Do you understand what could have happened to you?" "Yes." "And you still went in?" "Yes." He watched her, waiting again for more. "You did not know who he was?" "No." "And if you had known?" Zainabu held his gaze. "It would not have changed anything." The answer seemed to strike him harder than he expected. He had spent his life among people whose behavior transformed the moment they recognized money or influence. Here sat a market girl in a borrowed hospital chair telling him, with maddening sincerity, that his name would have meant nothing beside a drowning human being. "What do you need?" he asked at last. "Nothing," she said. He narrowed his eyes. "Everyone needs something." "Yes," she replied. "But not everything should be taken in exchange for doing what is right." Malik turned his head slightly, watching his father absorb words that could not be negotiated with or bought down. For the first time in years, Malik felt a quiet, almost dangerous kind of hope. That hope became action sooner than anyone expected. Before Zainabu left the hospital, Malik asked the question that altered the course of all three lives. "Can I see where you live?" he said. Idris turned sharply. "That is not necessary." Malik looked back at him without fear. "It is to me." Zainabu blinked, caught between alarm and disbelief. "You do not need to come," she said. Malik's voice softened. "I do. You came into my world because my life forced you there. I want to understand yours because I choose to." Idris dismissed the idea immediately. Malik, who had spent years swallowing everything, did not swallow this. "You keep saying you protect me," he said. "But all you have done is decide what I am allowed to know." Idris's jaw tightened. No one had spoken to him like that in front of another person in a very long time. Zainabu sensed that what was happening had little to do with her now, and everything to do with a father and son standing inside years of unsaid truth. She left soon after, but the tension traveled with everyone who remained. 2 days later, Malik went to the market anyway. He arrived in daylight, seated in his wheelchair, still weaker than he should have been, accompanied by one security aide who stayed a few paces back, under strict instruction not to interfere unless necessary. The market slowed, as if a hidden drumbeat had shifted. People recognized him at once. Zainabu was sorting her remaining stock when the silence reached her before his shadow did. She looked up and found him there. "You came," she said, and there was more concern than surprise in her voice. "You should be in bed." Malik smiled faintly. "I was. It became unbearable." She stared at him. "This is not your place." Malik glanced around at the noise, the bargaining, the dust, the movement, then back at her. "Neither was the river," he said. It was such an unexpected answer that Zainabu almost smiled, but the expressions around them kept her still. People were watching too closely. Too many meanings were already attaching themselves to the sight of them together. "You do not understand what this will become," she said under her breath. Malik's reply was quiet but steady. "Then help me understand." The confrontation everyone feared arrived minutes later. Idris Danjuma, informed by security and already on his way the moment Malik left the house, stepped into the market with the authority of a man who had never needed permission to enter any space. Conversations died. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. He looked first at his son, then at Zainabu, then at the ring of faces around them. "Malik," he said, "this is not where you should be." Malik held his father's gaze. "That is not why you want me to leave." Idris's expression did not crack, but something under it sharpened. "You are recovering." "And hiding me again will heal me?" Malik shot back. A murmur passed through the crowd. Zainabu felt suddenly as though she were standing in the middle of a door opening inside a wall that had been sealed for years. "I protected you," Idris said, low enough that only those closest heard clearly. Malik answered with the sentence that neither of them could take back once spoken. "You erased me." Silence dropped hard. Even Zainabu looked down for a moment, as if the truth itself had weight. Idris stared at his son, and for the first time he had no fast reply, no carefully shaped explanation, no language of provision or status strong enough to disguise what Malik had named. Zainabu spoke only because she could not bear to watch pain circle itself into pride. "Both of you are speaking truth," she said. They turned toward her. But truth does not become easier because it is finally said. Idris looked at her differently then, not as the girl from the river, not merely as his son's rescuer, but as someone standing outside their family and yet somehow seeing what those inside it had refused to name. "Why do you involve yourself in this?" he asked. The question was not cruel. It was weary, almost sincere. Zainabu answered the only way she knew. "Because I could not watch him disappear in the river, and I cannot watch the same thing happen while he is still alive." Something in that answer broke the last defense he had left. Not dramatically, not publicly. No tears, no collapse, no sudden transformation fit for gossip. Just a man standing in a noisy market, hearing his own failure in the calm voice of someone who had every reason to fear him and yet did not. Idris took a breath that seemed to come from very far inside him. "What do you want?" he asked Malik. His son did not hesitate. "I want to live without fear. Not walk, not be fixed, not be cured. Live without fear." Idris closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and turned to Zainabu. "You showed him something I could not," he said. She shook her head at once. "No, he wanted that long before me." Idris gave a slow, almost bitter nod. "Then perhaps you showed me something I refused to see." What happened next surprised the market even more than the argument itself. Idris did not offer Zainabu money in public. He did not perform charity for witnesses. He did not try to turn the moment into spectacle. Instead, he said, "Come with us, not to be rewarded, to speak." Zainabu frowned. "About what?" "About what changes now," Malik answered before his father could. She looked from one to the other and felt the danger of the path opening in front of her. She had siblings at home, rent due, food to buy, a life that could not simply pause while the wealthy discovered conscience. "My family needs me," she said. Idris nodded. "Then they will be part of the answer, not the price." She studied him for a long moment, searching for pride disguised as generosity, control disguised as gratitude. What she found instead was something more fragile and far less familiar on a face like his: uncertainty. "One condition," she said. "I do not become a story you tell about yourself. I do not pretend. I do not forget where I come from." Malik's smile returned, small but real. Idris said, "If this is done right, you will not have to." In the weeks that followed, Garoa watched with fascination, suspicion, admiration, and resentment as the impossible arrangement took shape. Zainabu did not move into the Danjuma house. She refused that immediately. Instead, Idris rented a safer, larger home for her, Safiya, and Bashir near their old neighborhood, so the children would not lose the world they understood overnight. He paid school fees quietly and set up a proper market stall in Zainabu's name, not as a gift to display, but as a business she controlled herself. When he offered more, she accepted only what could become stable and dignified, never what would turn her into an ornament of gratitude. Malik began leaving the compound more often, first to visit Zainabu's family, then to see the city, then to attend meetings he had never before been invited to join. At those meetings, he discovered that his father's empire had always contained space for him. It was only human courage that had been missing. With physical therapy chosen on his terms rather than imposed out of denial, he grew stronger in his upper body and steadier in his mind. With Zainabu nearby, he laughed more, spoke more, argued more, lived more. But change that matters is never free of resistance. Relatives whispered that Idris had been bewitched by a market girl. Business associates warned him that public sympathy was one thing, but allowing his disabled son such visibility would invite gossip. Some accused Zainabu of ambition hidden beneath humility. Others insisted she must secretly be promised marriage, money, or position. The poor distrusted the rich. The rich patronized the poor. Lines that had existed for generations do not vanish because three people decide they should. Zainabu felt that pressure most sharply. She heard it in the market, in the churchyard, in passing conversations cut short when she approached. "She knows how to climb," one woman said. "Today school fees, tomorrow inheritance." Another remarked, "No one stays close to power without wanting something." Zainabu learned to let such words pass through her. Malik, however, did not. The first time he heard someone dismiss her as a clever opportunist, he replied with a calm that silenced the entire room. "If she wanted power, she would have asked for it when I was in the river and the world was watching. She asked for nothing, even after she pulled me back into it." Perhaps because he knew what public judgment could do, Malik became Zainabu's loudest defender and, increasingly, her closest companion. Their bond did not arrive like a song. It grew the way real trust grows, through repeated presence, through visits where she helped him navigate streets his father once thought too rough for him, through evenings when he listened to Sophia read aloud from her school books and corrected Bashir's sums while Zainabu cooked, through conversations on hospital ramps, in market corners, under neem trees outside the new shop, where she told him about carrying too much too young, and he told her about being surrounded by people while feeling invisible. She never treated him like glass. He never treated her like a miracle sent to improve his character. They challenged each other. He pushed her to imagine a future wider than surviving each day. She pushed him to understand that dignity meant more than inclusion in boardrooms. It meant access, design, wages, transport, respect. Together, they forced questions into spaces that had long gone unquestioned. The most lasting result of their unlikely collision came 6 months after the river. Malik appeared publicly beside his father at the opening of the Danjuma Community Access Center, a project announced not as charity but as obligation. It combined rehabilitation services, vocational training, legal support for people living with disabilities, small business grants for women-led households, and an accessible school transport scheme for children who had previously stayed home because the city could not imagine them in motion. Idris funded it. Malik designed much of its mission. Zainabu, to the shock of nearly everyone who still underestimated her, became its first director of community outreach. She accepted the role on the condition that the center answer to the people it claimed to serve, not merely the family name above its gate. "If it becomes a monument," she told Idris the night before the launch, "it will fail." He nodded and said, without defensiveness, "Then help me keep it honest." On the day the center opened, the same city that had once watched a disabled man drown while waiting for someone else to act, now watched him speak for himself. Malik sat at the front of the hall in a tailored dark blue outfit, his wheelchair polished but unhidden, the microphone adjusted to his height, not the other way around. Idris stood beside him, not in front. Zainabu stood on the other side holding a folder full of names, plans, and budget notes, looking more uncomfortable with ceremony than with any river she had ever entered. When Malik began to speak, the room quieted completely. "Most of my life," he said, "people decided what dignity meant for me without asking whether I could breathe inside it. I was given comfort, protection, treatment, and silence. I am grateful to be alive. But being kept alive is not the same as being allowed to live." No one shifted. No one coughed. "The person who taught me that," he continued, turning slightly toward Zainabu, "did not come from my world. She came from truth. She saw a life in danger and acted before fear could make excuses. If this place means anything, it will mean that we learn to do the same for one another. Before it is convenient, before it is profitable, before we are asked. Idris looked down briefly, and though the crowd may not have understood the full cost of that moment, Malik did. After the speeches, after the handshakes and photographs and polite congratulations, when the noise had thinned and the sun had lowered, Zainabu found herself outside the new building near a line of young trees planted along the fence. Malik rolled out to join her. For a while, they stood there in companionable silence, listening to children chase each other across the courtyard. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. Zainabu laughed softly. "Sometimes my body still does." He smiled. "I think about how strange life is. I went looking for the world because I was tired of living behind a wall. I found a river instead. And nearly drowned in it," she reminded him. "Yes," he said, "but I found you there too." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Not as the boy she pulled from the water, not as the son of a powerful man trying to become better, but as Malik, a man who had stepped through fear and was still learning how to stay outside it. "You were already there," she said quietly. "I just refused to let the river keep you." He held her gaze. "And you still do." There was no crowd now, no father, no market, no spectacle of impossible worlds colliding. Just evening, and two people standing in the life that had grown from one uncalculated act of courage. In time, people stopped telling the story as if it belonged only to rescue. They began to tell it as a story about revelation, about a man who had everything except the freedom to be seen, about a girl who had almost nothing except the courage to act, about a father powerful enough to command a city and yet helpless before the truth of what love without acceptance becomes. Some still preferred the simpler version, the rich boy, the poor girl, the dramatic rescue, the destiny written by the river. But the deeper truth was better. Zainabu Musa did not change Malik Danjuma's life because she saved him from drowning. She changed it because she refused to let the world define humanity by status. Malik changed Idris not by nearly dying, but by finally saying aloud what silence had cost him. And Idris changed because, once truth stood before him in the market dust, it became more dangerous to deny it than to listen. That is how real change happens. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without resistance. It begins when one person decides not to look away, and another decides to answer honesty with more honesty, and a third is forced, finally, painfully, to understand that control is not love, and protection without dignity is another kind of wound. The river had nearly taken a life that night. Instead, it exposed 3 of them. And from that exposure came something stronger than rescue, stronger than fear, stronger even than power. The simple, difficult choice to see one another fully and live differently because of it.